So today we'll discuss the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which is entitled Nature, the Enjoyer and Consciousness. This title itself seems to be a little complicated, but actually the chapter is not complicated. In the previous chapter, Krishna concluded by saying the path of devotional service as the imperishable path leading to Krishna as the supreme goal. In this chapter, Krishna explains the distinction and the interrelationship between the body, the soul, and the supersoul. By knowing this, one can get liberation and reach the spiritual world. So, in the beginning of this chapter, Arjuna asks Krishna 6 questions. What are the 6 questions? What is field of activity? That's the first question Arjuna is asking. The second question is, what is the knower of the field? The third question is, what is knowledge? And the fourth one is, what is the object of knowledge? The fifth question is, what is nature? And the last question that Arjuna asks in this chapter, the beginning itself, who is the enjoyer? Now, Krishna gives systematically answers to these 6 questions one after another. First of all, Krishna explains what is the field of activity and who the knower of the field is. He says, this body is the field of activity, and one who knows this body is called the knower of the field. So Srila Prabhupada explains in the 2nd chapter, it is told that each one of us is soul and we are different from our body. The same thing is explained in a different way here. This body is called the field of activity, and the soul is called the knower of the field. The body as the field of activity for the soul is explained in this chapter as the soul is trapped in the body, and according to the body there are different facilities for enjoying the body for the soul who is trapped in the body. Now, the soul actually wants to enjoy his senses, but he is unable to have unlimited enjoyment. He is limited to enjoy according to the body he has got. Therefore, the body is described as the field of activity. Now, the difference between the field of activity and the knower of the field is not difficult to understand. Any person can consider from childhood to youth to old age, the body is changing, but he is the same person. So, his body is different from himself. So, his body is called the field, which is ever changing, and he, the soul, is the knower of the field, the knower of the body. So this is the clear distinction between the two. Krishna next says that he is also the knower in all bodies. This is a very significant statement by Krishna. What does this mean? In every body there are two knowers. One is the individual soul who is the knower of his particular body. Just like I know my body, you know your body, he knows his body. But Krishna is seated in our heart as super soul. So as a super soul, Krishna is seated in my heart, in his heart, in his heart, everyone's heart. So Krishna as a super soul is the knower of each and every body. So Krishna is the super knower or the super soul. So one who knows the body, the soul and the super soul is said to be in knowledge. So knowledge is knowing the body, the soul and the super soul. Now we should remember always this body or the field of activity is material, whereas the soul and the super soul, the two knowers of the body, are actually completely spiritual. Even though the soul and super soul both are spiritual, still the super soul is a controller of both the body and the soul. So the super soul is in the superior position and the soul is always in the subordinate position. Next, Krishna describes the different components of the field of activity. This field of activity or the body is made up of 24 elements. What are the 24 elements? Krishna describes them. There are 5 great elements: the earth, water, fire, air and ether. You would have heard of this. Earlier in the 7th chapter also Krishna had described these elements as part of material nature. Then there are 3 subtle elements: the mind, intelligence and false ego. This also Krishna had explained in the 7th chapter. Then there are 5 knowledge acquiring senses: the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue and the skin. Then there are 5 working senses: voice, hands, legs, anus and genitals. Then there are 5 sense objects. What are they? They are the smell, taste, form, touch and sound. Just like for the eyes, the sense object is form, or for the nose it is smell, like that. The last element, the 24th element, is called the unmanifested. Next, Krishna describes the interactions of the field of activity. There are 7 interactions in this field. They are described as desire, hatred, happiness, distress, the aggregate, the life symptoms and convictions. Now this really is a technical description of the field and its interactions. But what is important to understand here is the field is constantly changing, whereas the soul, the knower of the field, is unchanging. So this distinction between the field and the knower of the field, we should always remember. Next, Krishna describes 20 items of knowledge. We have some understanding of what is knowledge, what we study generally about this world or different subjects. Somebody may be studying one subject or one field. of knowledge one may be pursuing. But here Krishna describes something very, very fundamental as what is knowledge. He describes 20 items. What are the 20 items of knowledge? Humility, pridelessness, non-violence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching a bona fide spiritual master, cleanliness, steadiness, self-control, renunciation of the objects of sense enjoyment, absence of false ego, the perception of the evil of birth, death, disease and old age, detachment, freedom from entanglement with children, wife, home and the rest, even-mindedness amidst pleasant and unpleasant events, constant and unalloyed devotion to Krishna, aspiring to live in a solitary place, detachment from the general mass of people, accepting the importance of self-realization, and philosophical search for the absolute truth or philosophical search for God. These are 20 items of knowledge. Probably this is something you have never heard before unless you read the Bhagavad Gita. Now, Krishna explains these items constitute the process of knowledge. Srila Prabhupada elucidates what is this process of knowledge. If one accepts this process, then there is possibility of approaching God. Now, among these 20 items of knowledge, one most important item, one single item has been singled out as the most important item. What is that most important item? It is described as constant and unalloyed or pure devotion to Krishna. So, Srila Prabhupada says, if one does not approach or is not able to approach the transcendental devotional service of the Supreme Lord, then the other 19 items are of no value at all. So, we should understand that the process of knowledge leads to developing our pure devotion to Krishna. Now, among the remaining 19 items, Srila Prabhupada particularly points out that the item called accepting a spiritual master is extremely important also, because without taking directions from a spiritual master, there is no possibility of actually approaching God. So, some of these items we can discuss. Cleanliness is essential for making advancement in spiritual life. Now, there are two kinds of cleanliness. What we generally know as cleanliness is described by Prabhupada as external cleanliness. External cleanliness is possible to be maintained by taking a bath, wearing clean clothes, keeping your surroundings clean, etc. But there is something called internal cleanliness. What is internal cleanliness? One has to actually think of Krishna always by chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. What kind of cleansing does this chanting of Hare Krishna do? It cleanses our mind of all material contamination. Then, as regards the item called perception of the evil of birth, death, disease and old age, we should remember that even though we consider we have so many different difficulties or miseries that we may be facing at different times, the Bhagavad Gita points out there are 4 fundamental miseries. These are the 4 fundamental miseries: the misery of birth, the misery of death, the misery of old age and disease. Now, regarding these miseries, nobody will disagree on the point that old age and disease are miserable conditions. Old age here is meant invalidity due to old age. That means in old age, when these senses, the organs become weak or they malfunction, that is exactly what is meant by the misery of old age. So definitely these are miseries. Nobody will disagree. But how is birth misery? For that, Srila Prabhupada says one should study the Vedic literature and try to understand. Just to briefly mention the misery, what is this misery of birth? We should remember that before we were born, we were packed up in our mother's womb for 9 months. That's like being packed up in an airtight sack and surrounded by fluids like blood, mucus, urine, and all kinds of secretions, acidic secretions. So, the child inside the mother's womb, as described in the Vedic literature, undergoes a lot of pain and suffering. So, there are these miseries of birth. Of course, all of us have gone through it, but as soon as we come out of the mother's womb, we forget. So, therefore, we don't seriously consider what is the misery of undergoing birth. Similarly, the misery of death, that is also described in the Vedic literature. It is said the amount of pain a person undergoes at the time of death. We should remember that the soul doesn't die. That means the person, the real person inside the body doesn't die. Death means giving up this body and entering another body. So that particular misery, how is that a misery? It is explained that the person who actually dies or undergoes death, for him or her, it is like the pain experienced if thousands of scorpions were to simultaneously come and bite the person all over the body. This is just an example given. It means extremely painful, excruciatingly painful. We never have experienced such a pain in entire life. So that is the kind of pain we face when we have to undergo death. In any case, one should study the Vedic literature and discuss these fundamental miseries and understand that actually we should try to solve these problems rather than become busy with solving other problems. If one understands that I had to conquer death and I had to conquer disease, old age, rebirth, such a person is considered actually as very intelligent. So simply by accepting the process of devotional service and after quitting this body, going to the spiritual world to live with Krishna, thereby we are able to conquer birth, death, disease, old age. Because in Krishna's personal abode, there is no birth, there is no disease, there is no old age, there is no death, there are no miseries. So, therefore, one should be really making a solution to these fundamental problems by executing devotion, by doing devotional service and preparing oneself to go to Krishna. As for detachment from children, wife, home, etc., it is not meant that one should have no feeling for one's family members. No. All of them are natural objects of affection, but one should not be attached to them. That is the meaning. So, Srila Prabhupada explains the best process for making the home pleasant is Krishna consciousness. One has to just engage oneself and one's family members in 4 activities of Krishna consciousness. Particularly, Prabhupada mentions here. One is chanting Hare Krishna. The second activity is accepting remnants of foodstuff offered to Krishna, or accepting Krishna prasadam. We have to eat every day, but instead of simply cooking and just directly eating, after cooking vegetarian foodstuff, of course, one should offer to Krishna and accept the remnants as prasadam. Then have some discussion on books like Bhagavad Gita or other Vedic literature, and worship Krishna in the form of a deity or picture of Krishna. This way, these 4 activities will make the home pleasant, and thereby one will not have material attachments to such a home life. So if Prabhupada says if one can mold his family life in such a way that all the members of the family are engaged in Krishna consciousness, then there is no need to change from family life to renounced life. Neither in this Kali Yuga, in this age we are living in, it is recommended that somebody should actually leave family life and go away to the forest to accept a renounced order of life. No, that is not recommended for this age. Next, Krishna explains what is the object of knowledge. Now, so far we discussed 3 things: the field of activity, the knower of the field, and knowledge. The 4th one is, Arjuna has asked, what is the object of knowledge? Object of knowledge means what is knowable. Through the process of knowledge, what is to be known. So, Krishna explains there are 2 knowables. One is the soul, other one is the super soul. So, briefly Krishna explains the soul as knowable. What are the characteristics of the soul as knowable? One should know the soul is beginningless. How is the soul beginningless? Because the soul has no birth or death. What we consider as birth or the beginning of life is beginning of the soul's life in this body. At the time of death, the soul doesn't die, or I don't die, or you don't die, no person dies, but the person actually quits one body and enters another body. So therefore, the soul is not coming into existence at a time of birth, nor the soul perishes when the body is finished or when there is death. The soul is always existing. Therefore, the soul is described as beginningless, but the soul is subordinate to Krishna. The soul is always subordinate to Krishna. Because it's already been explained, the super soul is the controller of both the body and the soul. Therefore, the super soul is superior to the soul. Therefore, the soul we should know is beginningless and subordinate to the Supreme Lord Krishna or the super soul. The soul is also spiritual by nature, not material. Soul is spiritual by nature. The body is material, but the soul, or I, the real person inside the body, I am spiritual being. And the soul, being spiritual by nature, is beyond the cause and effect of this world. This world is constantly changing. There are so many changes which are taking place everywhere around us. Even our own body is changing. But that is the characteristic of matter. or the material world. As soul is spiritual, there is no change, never undergoes any change, is unchanging self. Then Krishna explains the super soul as knowable, as the other knowable. Now, super soul is described a little elaborately by Krishna. Everywhere are his hands and legs, his eyes and faces, he hears everything. In this way, the super soul exists. Unlike us, each one of us, we have 2 hands, we have 2 eyes, or maybe some other animal may have 4 legs. That's okay. But in any case, we have limited senses, limited organs. We have limitation of the capacity of our senses. But the super soul has unlimited eyes, unlimited faces, unlimited legs and hands. How do we understand this? The super soul is present in every body. So actually, our hands are not our hands. It is the hands of the super soul. The super soul is the original owner. It is just like if somebody is staying, let's say, in a rented house. So the owner of the house is not the person who is residing as a tenant. Owner of the house is different. The tenant is staying definitely, but he has got limited access and limited facility to stay in this house. Similarly, when we are in this body, each one of us, each soul inside each and every body can use the body in a restricted way, has got limitation. But this super soul is the real controller and the real owner of every sense, or all the senses, or all the hands, all the legs. So that is being explained here. The super soul has unlimited legs, hands, eyes, etc. And further the description is given that the supreme truth, the super soul, exists both internally and externally, in the moving and non-moving. He is beyond the power of the material senses to see or to know. Although far, far away, he is also near to all. See, the super soul is actually Krishna himself, who is in his spiritual world. Even though the spiritual world is very, very far away, still Krishna is near, because as the super soul, he is within our heart. So Krishna is simultaneously in his personal abode in the spiritual world. He is also within our heart as the super soul. So he is simultaneously present in the spiritual world and in the material world. So therefore he is described as, although far away, he is also near to everyone. He is beyond the power of the material senses to see or know. With our eyes or even with our mind or intelligence, we cannot perceive or see the super soul. He is in our heart, but we cannot see him. With our ordinary senses, with our ordinary mind or intelligence, we cannot know him or see him or perceive him. But by devotional service, it is possible to see him, to know him, to actually come face to face with him. That is explained in the scriptures. Like this, there is a little more detailed description of the super soul as the other knowable. Then Krishna describes the fifth item, nature. Arjuna asks, what is nature? And Arjuna also asks the sixth one, who is the enjoyer? So nature means here, Krishna explains, the material nature. This nature, what we know of as nature. This nature and the living being inside the body as the enjoyer. Just like every person inside the body is trying to enjoy with the body or enjoy the body itself. So, Krishna describes material nature and the living being as the enjoyer. Both are beginningless. Material nature always exists, though this material world is created, maintained and destroyed. The material energy from which this material nature is created or this material world is created, that material energy always exists. So at the time of creation, material energy is transformed into this material world. Similarly, at time of destruction of this entire material world, the material world is again transformed back into material energy. Similarly, the living being, the different spirit souls, the different individual spirit souls, they always exist. Of course, at a time of creation, they get a particular type of body. And at a time of destruction, they had to give up that body. And when complete destruction happens, what happens to the living beings, to the spirit souls? They are resting in the Supreme Lord's form as Vishnu. So Vishnu is the ultimate rest when everything is destroyed. And Vishnu actually begins the creation cyclically after the destruction is over. And that time he awards the different bodies to the different living beings. So therefore, Krishna is explaining here, material nature and the living beings are understood to be beginningless. Now the transformations which are happening, the changes which are happening in this world are actually due to material nature only. All the changes, even our body which is undergoing change, or we may experience some change of our own mind. Just like a small child, when I was a small child, I had the mentality of a child. Now I have the mentality of an adult. So the mind may change, the mentality may change, the intelligence may be more mature after a person changes the body from childhood to adulthood, but the person inside the body is unchanging spirit. So these changes of the mind or the intelligence or the body or even the changes outside that is happening, that is due to the material nature. That's not due to the spirit soul. Then Krishna explains, nature is said to be the cause of all material activities, whereas the living being inside this body, the soul, is said to be the cause of all suffering and enjoyment that that particular soul undergoes. What does this mean? This means if I am doing some material activity, actually I am not the actual doer. It is carried out by material nature according to my desire to do something. Just like, let's say I desire to lift this hand. So when I desire, actually what happens? Desire is mine. I desire to lift the hand. But then there is super soul inside my heart. Krishna is super soul in my heart. He has to sanction this. Every material desire for every person, the super soul or Paramatma has to sanction. And then when there is sanction of Paramatma or super soul, then material nature carries out this action of lifting the hand. We can very easily understand. Supposing a person has got a paralytic stroke, because of which even if the person desires to lift the hand, he cannot. Correct? Similarly, every material action or activity is actually carried out by material nature only on the sanction of the super soul after it is desired by the particular person or the soul. So, our role in any activity that we may do, we think we are doing, is only to the extent of desiring. And the activity itself will be successful only if the sanction of the super soul happens. And consequently, according to the sanction, material nature carries out that actual activity. Another way of understanding that material nature is carrying out the activity is this body is made up of matter. I am spirit. I am not this body. So this body is working under the control of material nature. So the material nature is controlling this body. Therefore, material nature has to carry out the activity as regards, let's say, some bodily movement. Similarly, everything outside us also is actually made up of material nature. So material nature is controlling it, all material objects, and material nature only actually brings about the changes. So this is important to understand that even though, let's say, I am not the doer of some material activity, why am I held responsible for that activity because of which I have to enjoy or suffer the consequences? Supposing I harm somebody, then the actual hurting is done by the action of material nature. Supposing I bang this table or I hit somebody, actual instrument is my hand, and my hand is moving by material nature. I desire to move this hand, but actually it is carried out by material nature. But still, it is happening because of my desire. Material nature is not deciding to move anything. Super soul is not deciding to move anything. It is only after I desire. Therefore, even though I am not the actual doer of any activity, I am held responsible because behind every action that I think I am doing, it is my desire to do it. Therefore, Krishna explains here that even though material nature is the cause of every material action, the living being is the cause of the various sufferings and enjoyment. So which means that if I want to avoid suffering, which all of us want, and I want to be happy, or I don't want suffering, then I have to control my desires. So that's exactly what happens when we do devotional service. When we do devotional service, we desire only to serve Krishna. And all such desires to serve Krishna result in our miseries being completely eradicated. We will not face any miseries. Service to Krishna is simply joy, is simply happiness, unlimited eternal happiness. So, Krishna like this explains the material nature as the nature. What Arjuna asked is what is nature, and the living entity as the enjoyer. But Krishna also says there is another enjoyer, the super soul, who is the supreme enjoyer, and it is his control under which everything is going on, as we already heard earlier. The super soul is actually the controller of the body and the soul. Therefore, if one surrenders to the super soul or Krishna and engages in his devotional service, then this body will not be, or the activities of the person will not be any cause of any suffering. Neither one has to take birth again after quitting this body. one can simply by doing devotional service return to the spiritual world to engage blissfully in devotional, loving devotional service to Krishna. So I'll stop here. Thank you. Hare Krishna.